Welcome to Sino Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer. Armies in the field constantly find themselves suffering from shortages that range from a lack of provisions to men and equipment. Since all the military writings advise exploiting these shortages, commanders must resort to concealment measures even as they seek to remedy the problem. Simple techniques often suffice, but more active deception measures, ranging from disinformation through charades and facades, might prove necessary. Thus, the Ming Dynasty Yun Gangmu advises, quote, when something is vacuous, make it appear substantial. When it's substantial, make it appear vacuous. Thus, when you have a surplus, show an insufficiency. When you have an insufficiency, display a surplus. Then you will excel at tricking, which is Kwang, which we saw before. You will excel at tricking the enemy. Food shortages quickly debilitate an army, but a lack of water dooms them to precipitous defeat. Knowing the status of the enemy's supplies is vital to deciding whether to quickly launch an assault or maybe tediously await their collapse. The need for concealment spawns several ingenious measures intended to deceive observers, as well as sometimes the army's own troops. In a few incidents, what we might call the ruse of plenty proved so successful that the opponents lifted sieges and withdrew their armies. The situation becomes especially complex if enemy observers can gain access to camps, fortresses, or cities, where they might readily note a lack of food, stumble across empty storehouses, observe signs of hunger, or hear people grumbling about deprivation. And even from afar, hunger might be detected from indications first mentioned in The Art of War. Sun-tzu said, men who stand about leaning on their weapons are hungry. If the men who are drawing water drink first, they are thirsty. If they are killing the horses and eating the meat, the army lacks grain. Even if total security can be achieved, deserters, opportunists, sympathizers might still betray the army and its status. Several methods were employed to obfuscate the enemy. The most common and most successful stuffed the sacks normally used for food with straw or dirt, covered mounds of earth with layers of grain, moved wagons about that were apparently transporting supplies, conspicuously fed grain to selected animals, or allowed fat animals to be captured, and they also openly feasted. A lack of water might be concealed by having soldiers appear to be taking showers in streams of rice, sand, or recirculated water, just as in the World War II movie Sahara, starring Humphrey Bogart, or otherwise seem to be lavishly wasting it. For example, about 562 A.D., Ho Chi, a commander who found himself cut off from logistical support by extensive flooding, built a number of earthen mounds within the encampment, and then he had them covered over with a layer of grain. Once they were finished, pretended to be seeking local knowledge, he had several inhabitants deliberately led through the camp for questioning. After they noticed the obvious grain mounds, a few hastened to inform the enemy about Ho Chi's ample provisions. This false information caused the enemy commander to discontinue planning a quick assault on what he assumed would be a severely debilitated force. In another famous case, Tandao Chi successfully employed the charade in 431 A.D. when he realized the army's provisions were exhausted and the troops were becoming disaffected. Certain that the soldiers who were deserting would inform the enemy of the army's plight, he reused the classic ploy. He filled sacks with sand, then placed a few containing real grain atop the piles. Advised that Tan had ample provisions, his enemies ceased their pursuit and executed the deserters for having made false reports. In an even more complicated version, a later Zhao general had 1,000 men conspicuously move sacks that had been filled with dirt into a citadel, just as if they were bringing in critical food supplies. Then, to confirm their authenticity and keep suspicion from arising, he had other troops transport sacks filled with rice. However, they were ordered to stop along the way as if they become fatigued, giving the enemy an opportunity to seize them. Finding the sacks stuffed with rice, they became depressed because it confirmed their enemies were well supplied. Feeding the increasingly large armies being fielded over time made sustainment critical. Sun-tzu therefore condemned prolonged campaigns, and he stressed the need to capitalize on whatever might be acquired in enemy territory. Quote, "The wise general will concentrate on securing provisions from the enemy. 1 bushel of the enemy's foodstuff is worth 20 of ours. 1 pico of fodder is worth 20 of ours." Pre-modern campaign armies normally resorted to plundering and foraging for their basic requirements, as well as to supplement any deficiencies that might arise. According to the 100 Unorthodox Strategies, a late Song Dynasty text, quote, "Whenever you mobilize the army to go forth on a punitive campaign, and you've deeply penetrated enemy territory, fodder and provisions will be scarce. You must segment your troops to forage and plunder. You'll be victorious if you occupy the enemy's storehouses and granaries, and you seize their accumulated resources, and thereby continuously provision your army." Now, conversely, because of the dire need for provisions, fabricated substantiality can be employed to lure the enemy into attacking when and where desirable. The military writers speak of bait, potential profits that presumably exist only for moments, and thus require quick decisions and fast action in rapidly evolving circumstances. Again, the 100 Unorthodox Strategies summarily states, "Bait refers to employing profit to entice an enemy into action. When 2 fronts clash, the enemy might release teams of cattle and horses, abandon material goods, or leave provisions and supplies behind. You should never seize them, because if you do, you will certainly be defeated." A tactical principle from the art of war states, "Do not take an army acting as bait." This ploy, and an alternative form that utilized phony provisions to entice attacks, were repeatedly used in China with considerable success. Even the Red Eyebrows, a religious millenarian group named from their distinctive custom of marking their foreheads, rather than their eyebrows, with red to distinguish themselves from their enemies, employed it against an imperial army early in the 1st century AD. While feigning a retreat under the pressure of a ferocious attack, they deliberately left numerous wagons heavily laden with soybeans and other grains behind. Because the imperial troops were famished, they fell to fighting among themselves over the provisions instead of exploiting the retreat and guarding against deceit. The Red Eyebrows then took advantage of the chaos to suddenly attack and inflict substantial casualties. In 679 AD, when Tang imperial armies found themselves battling insurgent Turkish forces, a famished Tang contingent suffered a severe defeat because their food had been seized. Knowing the lure of Tang provisions to the so-called barbarians, the commander concealed elite soldiers equipped with the best crossbows and broadswords in 300 wagons that were normally used to transport provisions. Then, to enhance their apparent vulnerability, he had weak and emaciated troops take responsibility for moving the shipment, but he also put stalwart soldiers in ambush. When the obviously exhausted soldiers stopped to rest, the vulnerable convoy presented an irresistible target. After they seized the wagons with a swift cavalry attack, the Turks unsaddled their horses and released them to graze. But instead of enjoying a leisurely feast, they were attacked and slain by the hidden troops. Now, both in China and in the West, a particularly pernicious form of deceit, leaving poisoned food and wine behind in an apparently forced retreat, took advantage of this tendency of long-deprived troops to gorge themselves on whatever they might acquire. Over the centuries, many contingents of jubilant soldiers voraciously consumed poisoned meat and wine, despite the potential danger, leading to illness, pain, and death. Even when untainted, the sudden ingestion of rich foods and excessive wine invariably led to laxity, stupor, and drunkenness, and this allowed their defenses to be overwhelmed, immense casualties to be inflicted, and even apparent defeats reversed. During the extended conflict for mastery of the realm that followed the Qin's collapse just before 200 BC, the well-known unorthodox Han general Peng Yue reportedly tricked the enemy's fighters into seizing 10 wagons of provisions supposedly destined for his forces. Naturally, they brought them back into their encampment and quickly cooked and consumed the grain. As a result, some 70 to 80% of the force that had been blocking the flow of provisions to a besieged city fell seriously ill and died, allowing the city to be resupplied. Now, this deceit in which poisoned provisions apparently can't be protected and are forcibly captured became so well known that the external peoples known in China as barbarians had their Chinese prisoners taste food that not only was captured from Chinese troops, but also came from China itself. Not surprisingly, dedicated chapters on the various deceits associated with concealing shortages and employing the lure of apparent profit continue to appear throughout history. As always, thank you for watching.